Hello and welcome. Welcome, Jessica Staines from Koori Curriculum. How are you, Jess? I'm really pleased to have you on today.
Yeah, really good. Thanks, Lisa. Thanks for having me.
That's okay. So please tell me, what do you think cultural competence is in a family daycare setting?
So I ended up moving away a little bit from the term cultural competence because I think for a lot of educators, assuming competence in a culture that predominantly probably isn't their own is a bit of a big task, I feel. And there's a lot of things in Aboriginal people's culture that we're not necessarily willing to share openly with people that are non-Indigenous. So instead, the terms that I began using is cultural capacity and cultural confidence. So I think for educators to really understand their role as non-Indigenous educators and be, I guess, dedicated and dogmatic in a sense to continue to learn about Aboriginal culture is really important. So understanding it's a journey and there's not necessarily one destination. But in terms of family daycare educators, I think it's the same necessarily as, early childhood educators, where we're really trying to just sprinkle those cultural perspectives across play spaces and holistically program and plan around children's interest to be including Aboriginal perspectives in context to whatever they're interested in.
Okay, that sounds great, but how do you actually do it? Like, what's the best way of teaching children in a family daycare setting about, Aboriginal culture? How can it be done in a way that just isn't tokenistic?
I think tokenistic and stereotypical and being offensive are words that really haunt educators. And I find that a lot of educators suffer from a form of analysis paralysis. They're so worried about doing the wrong thing that they tend to do nothing at all. I think whether or not an experience is token or not has really nothing to do with the tabletop resources that you have. You can have really elaborate setups or something that's very basic, but whether or not they're meaningful really has everything to do with what's happening intrinsically within the educator, whether or not they value the importance of doing what they're doing. If they're just doing it to tick a box or because it's NAIDOC week, then yeah, it probably is token. But if they understand the importance of including and embedding Aboriginal perspectives, then I think we have to unburden ourselves and be generous with ourselves and understand that we all have to start somewhere. We have to start where we feel comfortable and confident. And quite often in relation to Aboriginal culture, that's with experiences that could be considered touristy or that surface level. So, listening to the didgeridoo or reading dreaming stories or doing some dot painting with children, because that's what educators most commonly know about Aboriginal people in our culture, and that's where they feel comfortable to start. So I think there's nothing wrong with that, but eventually we need to develop our cultural capacity and start looking a little bit more broadly to consider ways that we can balance that out and include both traditional and contemporary perspectives, urban and regional perspectives, and local perspectives in our program. So, and I think you build that capacity and that confidence as time goes on. And it's just like anything else we do in early childhood, whether we start with a certificate 3, a diploma, or a teaching degree, the real work begins on the floor with children. And it's only through repetition and critical reflection that our practice begins to grow. And we get better at doing whatever it is that we're setting out to achieve with children. So by connecting with others, by engaging in online forums, by listening to podcasts, by reading Black literature, by attending community events, these are all ways that educators will begin to learn more about Aboriginal culture and see the links. I think it's probably important that we don't teach about Aboriginal people and culture as if we are a topic, a theme, or an interest. I think that can be quite tricky. So we don't want to be tacked on and separate, but instead really just be considering, so if the children are interested in transport, what could the Aboriginal perspectives of transport be? And just start small. So nobody is an encyclopedia of Aboriginal knowledge. Google searching can be a little bit tricky, but try and find those safe online spaces where you know that there's a supportive community for you to turn to and ask for advice. So we have a Facebook group called the Koori Curriculum Educator Community, which family daycare educators are more than welcome to join and be a part of. And they can post in there and say, this week the children are interested in fairies. Can anyone help me with what the Aboriginal perspectives would be? We're more than willing to help.
Look, I love that idea of, embedding it across everything. And it's I know for educators it can be hard to do that, but I hate it when that, NAIDOC week comes up or Aboriginal Children's Day and everyone suddenly goes, oh no, what are we going to do? For a lot of our educators, family daycare educators, perhaps even more so than the rest of the sector, have a wide multicultural background. And so a lot of them haven't grown up in Australia and know even less than white Australians know about Aboriginal culture. What's the best way for people in that situation to learn about Aboriginal culture?
Yeah, I think engaging in professional development workshops definitely helps, but attending some Aboriginal organisations or exhibits within your community. So trying to get out. So whether those are museums, galleries, during NAIDOC week and Reconciliation week, these are perfect times and opportunities for you to get out into your community and make those connections. There's often free talks happening at libraries during that period, or gatherings that are taking place. So, going onto the Reconciliation Week or NAIDOC website and putting in your postcode and seeing what's happening near you, subscribing to the Koori Mail, which is our national fortnightly newspaper, and looking at programs and events that are happening. So I think it's through that ongoing engagement. I also think potentially that educators that haven't had their schooling in Australia, they're coming into it in a great position, really, because a lot of white Australians that did do their schooling here, they're going through a process of unlearning and relearning because they were taught a false history or not an accurate depiction of Aboriginal people. And I find that educators from overseas, particularly First Nations peoples from overseas, they can relate to Aboriginal culture on a different level. And there's definitely synergy between First Nations people in Australia and other First Nations people around the world. So I think it's just really seeing it as being achievable, that it does take time, that there's no one book or workshop or community event, but just being determined and persistent, I think, is what's really key.
Jess, you alluded earlier about analysis paralysis, which I thought was a really good way of saying it. What advice can you give those educators that feel like they don't know enough, or that they don't know where to start, or that they're just really, really worried about doing it wrong?
I think it's really rare that anyone is going to come down on you if you're giving it a go. So I think it's better to do something than nothing at all, as long as you're coming into it with that genuine respect and that open mind and that willingness to learn. One of the things that I generally, advise educators to do is they could always put a note out to families or somewhere in their the entry to their homes that says, I'm really passionate about wanting to embed Aboriginal perspectives, but I'm not an expert. So if you have feedback or you have suggestions, please let me know. So coming into that position of not claiming expertise, but just be really humble and open to listening and learning and having that feedback. Something that I find is a really helpful resource for family daycare educators is to register for their own reconciliation action plans, and they can do this as a cluster, so with 2 or 3 other family daycare educators that potentially you can all working together and support one another. And we do that through an online platform called Narragansett, which is part of Reconciliation Australia. And what this does is it tells you what you should be doing, why you should be doing it, but it gives you lots of strategies and ideas. There's lots of readings, curriculum resources, free webinars. There's a wealth of information there. So, just working your way through that over a period of time, I think is really worth the investment into that platform.
Sure. I presume that some family daycare schemes already have a scheme-wide reconciliation action plan, but some may not, and it's still a good idea for individual educators to have their own.
That's right. And often it will complement what the scheme is doing, and the scheme is then better able to support those family daycare educators when they're able to understand what their goals are.
Yep. Just one final question. Can you talk about some of the best practice you've seen? It might be centre-based or it might be individual family daycare educator based, what sorts of things they'd be doing?
Yeah, so I think some of the best practices that I've seen are with family daycare educators where they're out and about in the community, that during NAIDOC week, reconciliation week, or they've just got their finger on the pulse with, things that are happening on a weekly or monthly basis. They're out and about with the children, engaging them in community events, so facilitating relationships for children with First Nations people. Um, Also, I think educators that try to find ways to include Aboriginal perspectives in children's interests on a regular basis. So you're not having to do it for each and every interest that comes about, but just being mindful and always considering, what are the cultural perspectives of this? How can we, what books might exist that can complement what the children are doing? And I think, we don't have to have heaps of resources. And sometimes it can be just as simple as saying, did you know that Aboriginal people used to follow ants to find water when the children are interested in insects? So it doesn't always have to be a resource or a big play-based experience or something huge. It's just those little simple, statements that we're making to children on a regular basis that I find have meaning. Yeah.
And I think that that's why it's really important for educators to take it on themselves to learn about Aboriginal culture, because if you didn't know that the thing about ants, then you couldn't introduce it to children. So it's first of all educating yourself.
Yeah, and it's beyond just learning about the history, it's learning about all those little cultural things so we can find those links, as you say. So please feel free to join our Koori Curriculum Facebook group because there's a wealth of resources in there.
So if people just search Koori Curriculum on Facebook?
So if they search Koori Curriculum Educator Community on Facebook, they'll find us. It's in the group section. It's separate to our Facebook page. So they're more than welcome to join. And, when those interests do come up and you're not sure what the Aboriginal perspective is of frogs or out of space or houses, just put a post in there and the community is more than happy to assist you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for joining us, Jess. I really appreciate it.
No worries. Good luck, everybody. Thanks again for having me.